So my name's Iain Corby. I'm the director of the Age Verification Providers Association. We're a trade body representing about 25 global providers of age assurance, which is both age verification and age estimation technology. So we fly along, I guess, adjacent to the identity world. Now, the session today is talking about protecting vulnerable identities online. I hope it'll be interesting to you. It may only be interesting for the fact to see whether we get the technology to work. But unfortunately, Rachel had a puncture on her way here, so we have challenged the technical team to see if they can zoom her in. But while they're doing that, let's just do a quick introduction. I think I'd ask you to introduce yourself, Nick, but I think everybody here knows you pretty well already. But just for those online who might be joining late, do you want to say who you are?
Yes, so I'm Nick Mothershaw. I'm Chief Identity Strategist at the Open Identity Exchange.
Thank you. And Mark?
I'm Mark Cooley. I'm the Head of Sales at Age Check Certification Scheme.
Brilliant. And let's launch straight in to see if this is going to work. So, Rachel, would you like to introduce yourself? And if that's successful, you can perhaps start by answering the first question, which is, what is it that you do that might help to protect vulnerable identities online?
Hi, everybody. So my name is Dr. Rachel Connell. I'm founder and CEO of Trust Elevate, and we're a child age verification and parental consent provider. We operate a zero data model. So when a parent says, I'm the parent or guardian of this child, we verify whether that assertion is true or not, and then we verify the age of the child. And it's never been more important and pressing for us to think about protecting vulnerable young users. My background is in forensics, tracking paedophile activity online and looking at the implications for investigative strategies. That was way back in like '96, and then I set up the first UK Internet Safety Centre, developing programs of education to help children and young people. And then I worked within industry as the CISO, the Chief Security Officer for Bebo, a social networking site, and set up the abuse management systems and saw firsthand the pro-suicide, pro-anorexia, bulimia, paedophile activity. The challenges that kids are exposed to online on a routine basis are really quite shocking. And so for the last 10 years I've been working in the identity verification sphere and specifically looking at how we can verify specific identity attributes. Like I have an identity attribute that I am a parent. I am also over 18. So can we check those attributes in a way that's privacy preserving for the goal of protecting vulnerable identities online and looking at how we can meet the Comment 25 requirement that was adopted by the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children, which stipulates that companies must exercise a duty of care towards children and young people and consider their best interests over and above profits. So Trust Elevate, we've been involved in UK government-funded trials. We're looking at the issue of the verification of children online, and our service was deemed to be proportionate, feasible, and viable. And when we've tested it with parents and young people, parents are like, why doesn't this exist already? So we're currently running large-scale trials, and the results are very positive, and we're looking for a launch date towards the end of Q1 2022. So that's me and Trust Elevate in a nutshell.
Thanks, Rachel, and hope we could hear you well here, so congratulations to the tech team on making that happen. Perhaps you could, we'll stay with you while it's working, and just tell us a little bit about how the Trust Elevate solution works.
So we check against authoritative data sources, and when we were designing this, we wanted to not hold any data. So the parent provides specific data points, the child's first name, last name, and date of birth. We want to deliver our service. We won the BT Better World Innovation Award. Every parent has a phone with them the whole time, right? Especially when you have kids, because you're worried about them the whole time. So we're working with BT to have and EE to have our service white labeled and delivered from within the mobile operator's phone. So as a parent of like a 4 or 5 year old, I will register my children. So that's basically a simple process of adding their details. We are firmly do not believe in any facial scanning or biometrics or document scanning. We've worked for 4 years to reduce the impediments to any onboarding flow. So it's a simple question of typing the details in, and those are checked against authoritative data sources. So when a child goes on to Lego or whatever app they want to know, you get an in-app notification. So I could be on this call, bing, I've already been verified as a parent of the child, so I can approve or block that child's access up past the data processors, and I can consent or not to those data processors once the specific purposes are clear and I've reviewed those, and I can revoke permission to data processing at any point in time. From 13 in the UK, 13-year-olds are deemed to be proficient at reading privacy policies and understanding cookies and the whole nature of the data ecosystem that is harvesting and surveilling them. So we enable those 13-year-olds, I'm being questioning there, provocative. So we're enabling those 13-year-olds also to grant, deny, or revoke consent. So we're operating a model of privacy as expected, right? Not the corporate, so we're counteracting the corporate surveillance that's going on. And why is that so important? We really do need to understand that data-driven harms are the big issue that we need to deal with. So Facebook's own research, so Facebook and mobile social media gaming, I don't want to pick one in particular, they collect between 5,000 and 8,000 data points about us, which create a psychographic profile. They then observe the content that we're viewing and surface that again. So 1 in 3 young girls are negatively impacted by these social media platforms surfacing content. Like, for example, if you're feeling, you're having a fat day and you think, well, maybe I might want to get some dieting tips. If you spend a long time watching that video, you'll get more and more videos around that. And the content that is out there about starving yourself and eating disordered behavior has a negative impact. So the data-driven harms are the recommendation engines are leveraging the psychographic profiles using predictive analytics to surface that content to young girls and also to young boys with concerns about their body image and promoting body dysmorphia, etc. So we really need to be attendant to the fact that data rights are human rights. How do we empower and enable these young people with the tools, knowledge, and skills so that they can actively participate in the online digital and playgrounds that are designed for them. So if platforms know the age bands of the users, then they can create safer spaces, and a regulator can work with those platforms. One of the other pieces of work that Trust Elevate is doing is creating a child rights impact assessment for product developers and data scientists and commercial teams to look at the age bands as stipulated in the ICO Age Appropriate Design Code, then look at the features, AI, ML, deep learning, computer vision, the behavior modification techniques, the risks and harms, and the mitigation strategies, so that they can map their decision making and a regulator can review that decision making, and for that to be linked to the abuse management systems, so that as you release a new product, you see the nature of the reports of harm associated with that, which can inform your decision making about which features to make available at a granular level to kids in a different age band. So we're at the cusp of a really exciting change that is long overdue in the protection of vulnerable young people online.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Stay with us, hopefully, and we'll see if we have some questions later from the floor or online. Nick, perhaps I could turn to you. So the conversation today is around protecting vulnerable identities online. I mean, my life's pretty much an open book. I don't really have a problem with sharing my data online. In fact, I kind of gave up a long time ago trying to keep anything secret. But there are people who, transacting online, whether it's because they're in repressive states or because of religious or cultural sensitivities, are nervous about sharing their identity online. What sort of work has your organisation been doing in this field?
It's interesting, isn't it? If we listen to the previous panel, there was, the kind of tail end of that, there was a lot of talk about privacy and how do people remain private and anonymous online. So we've got this tension between the desire, I guess as an adult desire, for privacy and not to be marketed to and not to have your data harvested, but also our desire to protect those who are vulnerable, children and other adults who are in a vulnerable position, by putting some layer of control and assistance around what they're doing. And from our perspective, all of that sits in some kind of trust framework. So we need to implement a set of rules, procedures, codes that sit across the ecosystem that enable that those who wish to be online but not have their data shared and harvested to control that in a way that is appropriate to them, but also allow those who are at the wards of vulnerable people, if you like, to make sure that those people are not being abused. And all of that needs to work in harmony. And people's status will change. So I think what's really interesting with what's happening with Trust Elevate is you're bringing children into the ecosystem through the parent at a really young age. And then they age up. They get to 13 and they get some, they're getting their own rights and responsibilities under law, and they start to gain trust. And as that identity then ages up, we should know how old they are because they've been vouched into an ecosystem around identity. They've been vouched in by a trusted party, their parents, who better to vouch them in. So this is the identity then that they can carry forward with them into life. And when they're 16, 18, prove their age, they can attach their passport to it. So all of this needs to work in harmony and not in isolation if we're going to solve this problem. And it also tells us, we often get asked, how long is this going to take to solve this problem online? And on that basis, we're going to talk later about inclusion. And there's a lot of young people are excluded from identity at the moment for various reasons. Again, if people are starting now with sub 13-year-olds, it's going to take us 5 years for the oldest of those to be aged up to be in young adulthood. So just on that progressive, we're on a 5-year course, and then a 10-year and a 15-year to get some of the youngest through. So this is a long journey we're on as we bring people into the ecosystem. What we don't want to do is bring them into an ecosystem that actually, at the end of their childhood, they need to now move to a new one. And we lose all the knowledge we've gained, and we've learned all the knowledge they've gained around managing their identity. So we need to join that up into the overall ecosystem as we go.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned vouching as well, because one of the troubles we have in age verification is there's plenty of data sources to help prove somebody's an adult or not. But as you get below 18, people tend not to have a passport. They certainly didn't have a driving license under 17. They don't have a credit record. Right. So it becomes a much more challenging issue, but one where the legislation now is driving us to need to know not just if somebody is an adult or a child, but even what age they are as a child. Rachel, you were nodding vigorously there. Do you want to just react to what Nick was saying?
Yes, I think, Nick, I absolutely. I think there's been a focus I've been talking about child age verification for about 12 years, and there was a sense, certainly when the EIDAS framework was being developed and the original team looking at gov.uk Verify, the response was, it's too difficult. It's in the too difficult box. We have to sort out 18 plus first. And I'm really happy that we've reached the stage that now we're saying, okay, we have to sort this out. And Trust Elevate is kind of leading the way in terms of addressing the issue. It's the authorised, and Article 8 of the GDPR is very specific. It's the authorised holder of parental responsibility for the child. So we need to think about digital parenting in all settings. So it's not just the kids in the kind of, if there is such a thing as an average home, but kids in all different types of settings, in care, unaccompanied child asylum seekers. And luckily what's happening now is that we've got people applying a lot of energy and brains power to figuring out how we address those issues. And part of the work that we're doing is looking at, as the kid transitions in a pathway through the care system, there are different authorised holders of parental responsibility. How do we enable that handover? From a technical perspective, that's feasible, but we also need to develop the policies and procedures so that people have the relevant information to them and that there's appropriate oversight from a regulatory perspective. So it is a hard nut to crack, but it's not an impossible one to crack. And educating kids to understand digital identity and their use of it, and the power that it gives them to ensure that their rights are respected by companies, seems to be a very compelling proposition.
that certainly was the finding of the VOCO, the Verification of Children Online program of work that DCMS conducted when children were interviewed about this. So younger children are concerned about weirdos and pervs and negative content. Slightly older children, those 13 plus, are concerned about the misuse of their data rights and how they can claw back some control over that. So, yeah, so I guess, Nick, I think your points are well made. I hope the timeline isn't as long as you say, that will affect change faster. I hope that in 5 years' time, we'll look back and we'll say to each other, imagine, we used to just let kids go anywhere on the internet. What were we thinking?
Thanks, Rachel. And Nick, you mentioned the importance of a trust framework. Perhaps I can bring Mark in on this now, because perhaps, Mark, you could explain a little about how the age check certification scheme is working to build that trust framework in the age area and possibly in identity as well.
Yeah, so we're a UCAS accredited conformity assessment body. We independently test the age and identity check systems work. We also certify them as well using our own and international standards. With regard to the digital trust framework from DCMS, we intend to be a certification body there. So although there's scheme in the company name, we won't be a scheme, we'll be a certification body. We will audit identity providers that are applying to a scheme prior to that. We have recently developed an age-appropriate design code certification scheme and a UK GDPR certification scheme for age and ID check providers. Now, we see that as a really pivotal moment for the industry and for the ecosystem. And that's on the basis that there's a lot of data out there that shows that public trust in digital identity is fairly low, as I think both Nick and Rachel have touched on. They're not really sure, the public aren't really sure what's happening with their data, and they're not sure what's going to happen with it if they ever request that their digital ID is deleted. So we've developed our UK GDPR certification scheme, so we can give identity providers a certification mark that essentially will tell the public that their GDPR policies is reaching the boots on the ground, and that's actually happening in practice.
And you mentioned the UK Accreditation Service. So just tell us a bit how that fits internationally with accreditation around the world.
So the UK Accreditation Service is essentially the gold standard in terms of regulating and accrediting conformity assessment bodies. So it means that we're acting in the best interests of being impartial and independent. So we've got a lot of oversight with our impartiality panel. And so we're not going to favour any particular technology or any particular digital identity provider. Essentially what we do is we will ask you what your system does and how it does it, and then we will test that and make sure that it does what it says on the tin.
And Nick, do you see the benefits of sort of certification in this field?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we want to see is the certification is interoperable across different markets. So, you know, because we want identities to be interoperable across different markets. We don't want someone to have one identity for age, one identity for finance. We want that if the person chooses, they can have an identity that works in all those different circumstances. So certification that you're doing it on an age basis, if we can make that modular, and so actually, well, you've done 90% of what needs to be done for finance. There's only these couple of bells and whistles that need to be added onto finance because they want some extra data or they want some checks against these data sources. Then it means my identity then flows easily across the whole ecosystem. But I think the thing with certification, and particularly the UK context, this is a massive move for an identity market because it's not regulated today across the whole ecosystem. And the UK trust framework, and it's important, the nuance in there, it's the UK digital identity and attribute trust framework. So it's not just about identity, it's about attributes that come with the identity as well. So it's quite broad. This is new and it's going to be regulated. And people supplying across all sectors, not just age verification, will need to be certified. And rightly so, as providing verification to the right standard. And that's not just the proofing element, so it's not just working out who someone is and that this is who they claim they are, but it's everything that goes around that. And that's where we use the term trust framework, not just kind of proofing rules. It's okay, right, I've got that, how do I re-recognize someone? So with the children, how do I re-recognize them? Is it because they're on a device that's in part of the ecosystem? Is it because of their face, which is going to change as they age? So is it fingerprints which grow? So all of those different elements all build into the ecosystem, along with GDPR, liability, rules around user presentation, rules around what happens when something goes wrong, redress, complaints, is there an ombudsman, who's liable if anything goes wrong? All of these things play in every single part of the identity ecosystem, and all of that is becoming a regulatory condition that identity providers will need to meet to provide their services to businesses. And so this is a huge change. And what I think is great is that in the age sector, with what you've done with ACCS, is you're way ahead in terms of lots of other sectors in terms of formal certification. None of the other sectors have got to that stage yet. They're working on risk-based assessments against guidelines. There's no formal certification in place. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think we were very lucky, and I'll ask Rachel to come in a second on the lessons learned from standardization within the age verification sector. But what that's allowed us to do is to set a clear delineation between good quality age verification providers and people who might just say tick a box or enter your date of birth or might pretend to do something more complex, but in fact they're just saying yes after 5 minutes. And to be able to have an independent third party to certify against that's been very helpful. It's also allowed us now to go on to create through the EU consent project interoperability across AV providers across Europe, which is quite an exciting European funded project, which will have a pilot in the new year and be live for people to join in the summer. But that is all built upon the early work that Rachel did. And Rachel, I wonder if you could talk about PAS 1296 and any of the lessons learned from that for both the new standards that we're developing in age and perhaps more broadly across identity.
Yes, it was a huge honour to be the technical author of the BSI standard on age checking. And one of the key lessons around that were it has to be inclusive. We had to bring in people with an expertise and knowledge in identity, obviously, but also in human rights and consumer rights specifically. So how do you develop a standard that can be used and is essentially a sister standard to the identity standard? So we worked with the folks at the EIDAS at the EU level, the NIST folks, the Canadian DIAC, trust framework people. So there was a lot of consultation done because you need to be able to support mutual recognition and interoperability. And then it was a challenge. How do you create an identity attribute standard, attribute checking, that differs slightly from the levels of assurance that are applicable in a full identity verification approach? So how can you facilitate slightly lower levels of assurance, and so that it is not an onerous and burdensome process for parents or children to go through? How can you build in a verify once, use many times model? Again, from that cognitive load that you don't want people having to enter their details multiple times. So it was a very interesting process. It was supposed to take 9 months. It took slightly longer, but there was a lot to learn from that. And we adopted what Johansson and Richter had developed around the vectors of trust. So levels of assurance, as you know, it's kind of a linear. The more data I get, the more assurance I can give. Now, the massive problem with that and the alternative to that is an orthogonal model. So you're looking at the identity proofing, you're looking at the device, the credential issuance, and you can get an understanding of the tokenization of the responses. You can have yes/no responses to things. So an orthogonal model gives you a little bit more freedom in terms of unpacking the identity from the attributes, the full identity check from the attributes. So that was a really interesting process and a steep learning curve for some of us in that group. And the PAS has been well received by folks at NIST in the US standards body, the Canadian body, and others. So it's the means by which you can cater for identity attribute checks. Yeah, I think that's it. Now, the next standard, it's now gone forward to going to ISO, and there's a reversion back to levels of assurance. So we'll see how that plays out. Having alternative ways to do things that are standardized and enable mutual recognition and interoperability are critical to maintain. They're the foundational stones around which the trust framework is built. And it creates, and the very cool thing is it created a marketplace.
Sorry, thanks, Rachel. And Mark, how does certification help to protect vulnerable identities?
So one way that you could look at protecting vulnerable people through certification is something that we ask for during the certification process is a practice statement. How do you go about verifying this person's age or this person's identity? Now, people would be able to choose whether they use that system or not based on the methods used, based on data minimization. As I said, we certify what it says it does on the tin. The other way that it can protect vulnerable identities is as part of an ongoing monitoring program. So if we've certified someone to being compliant with UK GDPR, it is ICO approved criteria, and we do have to perform an ongoing monitoring program to ensure that they continue to remain compliant with UK GDPR. So those vulnerable people would know that their data is secure and it's being held securely and in compliance with UK GDPR.
Thanks. Do we have any questions from the floor or online?
So it's Iain.
1 second, sorry, Iain. There we go.
Thank you. Hi, Iain. It's more of a comment than a question. So I work for a retailer that is selling age-verified products across multiple geographies. We've done a lot of work with Mark and the team at ACCS. And one of the useful things, I think, is the work has identified not only where we have gaps, but where we may over-err in terms of gathering data. So one of the points made earlier, that we gather this plethora of data simply because we don't know. We don't know if it's good enough, if it's strong enough. We know that we're regulated and we face a compliance issue, but then how do we manage that? Do we either do what I think you touched on earlier, which is tick the box and say, okay, that's good enough, or do we go the other way and just do everything we possibly can, or find some place in the middle? So we end up not really knowing. And I think one of the advantages of the work we've done with ACCS is we've been able to look at our policies, our processes, our systems, and start to identify where the gaps are and address the real problems, if you like, that allow us to both be compliant as well as be sensitive to privacy and everything else.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that prompts a comment from me, perhaps to go to Rachel again in a second. As we look at parental consent in the EU project that we're doing at the moment, there's quite a lot of people who are telling us that it's not possible to connect a child to an adult, to the responsible adult. And the US approach under the COPPA legislation there is simply to find any adult, perhaps check that they are an adult, and then assume that that's good enough. And there's and in fact, I think you can go further than that, Rachel, can't you? And presumably you would think that sort of COPPA approach isn't really good enough for Europe.
Yeah, I don't think it is, and I think GDPR is attempting to push us further than what COPPA laid down. The COPPA, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in the US came into force in 2000, right? We're into 2021, on the verge of 2022 now. What I think is really important to note is that, for example, Trust Elevate enables digital onboarding of child and teen bank accounts. You don't have to go into a bank if you use our service. So we can meet the KYC, we can enable banks to meet the AML requirements and KYC requirements. And that's really critical. We were just a part of the Global Open Finance Challenge, and got through to the semi-finals, we were looking at leveraging open banking APIs. So we could link bank accounts of a parent and a child, even if the parent and child were in different banks, or the parent is using a bank account and the child is using a fintech thing like Rooster or GoHenry or whatever. So we're creating that connection. We're verifying that relationship between the parent and child. So there are instances, such as opening a bank account, where that's a critical process. Right now, it's an in-branch thing. You physically have to go into the branch with your identity documents and your child and have somebody eyeball you and say, how likely is it that this person is actually the adult with parental responsibility for that child? And I know from personal experience, if you come from a different country and your child has a different surname, you have to be very stubborn to get a child bank account open. So I think what I'm saying here is that there are lessons to be learned from other sectors where there's a legal requirement for this to happen. And I think, for example, Trust Elevate has succeeded in doing that. So that can trickle down into other environments such as social media and gaming, where you do, and it will enable something like Google Family Sharing or Apple Family Sharing. The capability exists, and it's something that we should insist on companies using over time.
Thanks, Rachel. Just final comments from the two in the room here with me. Nick?
Yeah, so I'd make a final comment on on levels of assurance and the problem they cause. Where you've landed in terms of verifying someone's age, you aren't really calling that a level of assurance, and you're not mapping that to a UK level of assurance. You probably can do and say, well, it's above low, it's medium, but you haven't pegged to a level of assurance. So in the UK, you've got low, medium, high, very high. You've got IL 1, 2, 3 NIST. You've got low, substantial, high in EIDAS. They all mean different things, and when they've been defined, they tend to have been defined by a government, and they've come out of the security culture. So we in security land, we have classifications, and we classify documents, and we vet people to certain levels. You've got to be SC cleared to do that, etc., etc. So that same philosophy has come out to create levels of assurance, but that's not something we normally do to consumers. We don't normally peg them and say, oh, you've got this level of trust, or you've got that level of trust, or and I can't really think of any example where you do that to consumers. Where do you ever, McDonald's employees have stars. It's this concept of working to a finite and fairly small number of levels of assurance. I just simply don't think is going to work in the market. Each use case is going to have its own risk profile. Companies within that sector have different risk profiles, and that's quite right. And companies are often working in multiple legislations. So I think either, if you're sticking with the concept of levels of assurance, we need a lot more notches on the dial, particularly at the lower end. When we interleave other data into that, not just core identity data, suddenly that just becomes impossible. You can't maintain a level of assurance matrix. So I think we're heading for a world where, yes, we have some levels of assurance as benchmarks, but actually you need to understand the rules you're working with. If you can take an ID that you've established for, to establish someone's age and add some attributes to it and meet AML requirements, none of that has involved a formal level of assurance, but you've met two legal requirements for two different sectors. I think this, as an industry, we need to think about this level of assurance concept and whether we're actually more into regulatory rules interpretation at point of service than we are about pegging levels of assurance, because they don't stick anyway. If I assess someone, oh yeah, I can trust you at this level today, does that mean I can trust you at that level forever? Not necessarily. I might have got that wrong. Your circumstances might change. There's always an opportunity to take an out-of-way fraudster. So I think, this conversation has made me think more, again, about the level of assurance challenge.
Good. Well, we've got something to talk about over lunch at least.
Yes.
Mark?
I think that digital identity, a lot of the speakers today have shown that digital identity has a number of ways of improving the lives for vulnerable people, whether that's an identity that's a photograph and says 18 plus, or whether that offers a way to identify criminal, terroristic behaviour online through social media, because you have to verify your identity to sign up. I think if it's properly done, properly implemented, then we could really improve the world through digital identity. However, ACCS's mission is to raise the bar in visible compliance and visible standards with that, and I think regulation and certification will play a pivotal part in it.
Thanks. And Rachel, just because we can, through the wonders of modern technology, we'll give you the last word before lunch.
Thank you. I was agreeing with Nick so much, and I think what is really interesting is that we are now seeing regulators coming together and having a cross-regulatory approach. So the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Competitions Markets Authority, the ICO, and Ofcom are all coming together saying, okay, we're living in an API economy. You're on a social media platform. You may be doing a bank-to-bank transaction and leveraging the Payment Services Directive. So it's not just GDPR, PECR, Payment Services Directive, and AML. Like, on one platform, you may need to comply across business verticals with all of those. So the end user also needs to be considered in that. And I think we're moving definitely towards meeting the regulatory requirements as a substitute or alternative way of viewing the whole levels of assurance, because levels of assurance are quite problematic. So I would echo that approach and also highlight this cross-regulatory approach, which I think will make a significant impact on businesses in the API economy.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think hopefully the age verification sector has made some headway as being a bit of a lead here, using standards, trying to set a roadmap for others to follow, and we will continue to do so. I always say that age verification is the ability to prove your age online without disclosing your identity. There's a possibility that we then get into the anonymity online, and it's a way of proving you're a real person, again, without disclosing your identity unless there's just legal cause. So it may be our architecture can help with that. I'd like to thank our panel, particularly those who stepped in at the last minute, which is at least, well, in fact, it's all 3 out of 3, really, because Rachel was a fairly late addition as well. And if you could join me in thanking them, and also thanking the amazing technical team who, with literally 15 minutes notice, brought Rachel to our screen. So thank you all very much.